Macduff Lives. And tonight, reading from War Against the Weak by Edwin Black. And it's kind of a both important and tragic chapter. This is chapter 16 called Buchenwald. And welcome once again to the new studio where we've got a number of options how to set up. And tonight I'm trying a new one, just trying it out. And we'll see what people think about this particular angle. This is the third new angle we've got. And okay, I see Andy. Andy is operating our StreamYard from remote, from way up in Michigan. And so he's going to be participating tonight by tossing up some images and text that will be helpful to illustrate the show, illustrate the story of Buchenwald. Buchenwald concentration camp near Weimar. The little camp, the isolation and quarantine section of Buchenwald, Block 57, one morning in late May of 1944. Three-tiered geometric boxes lined the barrack. Each housed as many as 16 emaciated humans per shelf. A thirsty and exhausted Frenchman named OLoughlin struggled to climb down from the top level for his day's work, but he was too weak to climb out and negotiate the 8 feet down. As OLoughlin lay limp, a fat, well-fed inmate doctor walked in. The other French prisoners pleaded with the doctor that OLoughlin was too ill and suffered from severe rheumatism, making his every movement painful. The frail man needed medical attention. A small infirmary stocked with medicines and called the hospital had been established in the little camp. The doctor controlled access to the facility and the drugs. Those admitted to the hospital could be excused from work until nursed back to working strength, and thereby live another day. But the doctor, himself a prisoner, yet reviled as a barbaric stooge of the SS, was known for refusing admission to the hospital, except to those he favored, or those who could bribe their way in by turning over their relief packets. Most of all, the doctor hated the French communists. They, and their diseases, were everywhere in the little camp. The doctor believed that each inferior national group was a carrier of its own specific set of diseases. Frenchmen, he thought, brought in diphtheria and related throat diseases, as well as scarlet fever. Simply put, the little camp doctor was unwilling to use his limited hospital to lessen the prisoners' loads, extend their lives, or relieve their suffering. The prisoner's job was to work. His job was to ensure they kept working until they could work no more. Furious and impatient, the little camp doctor pushed the others out of the way, stepped onto the lowest of the 3 tiers, reached up and grabbed OLoughlin's emaciated foot as it dangled over the edge. He then yanked OLoughlin over the short sideboard and down the 8 feet to the floor. OLoughlin tumbled to the floor like a doll and cracked his skull. Blood soaked down the back of his shirt. As the life seeped out of OLoughlin, his comrades hauled him onto the lowest bunk and then hurried out to their backbreaking labors at the quarry. When they came back to Block 57 that night, OLoughlin was dead. Next to the bathroom was a makeshift morgue. They moved his body there. Later, OLoughlin's body waited its turn at the crematorium. The French inmates of the little camp never forgot the brutality the doctor showed them while exhibiting seemingly incongruous medical compassion to others. They never forgot that while most of them were worked and starved into skeletons, the doctor ate well. Many prisoners lost 40% of their weight shortly after arriving in the little camp, but the doctor arrived at Buchenwald fat and stayed fat. No one could understand how a talented physician could render his skills so effectively to some while allowing others to die horrible deaths. After Buchenwald was liberated in April of 1945, the stories about Dr. Edwin Katzenellenbogen emerged in French reports and then in occupation German newspapers and the Allied Armed Forces media. Katzenellenbogen was accused of murdering 1,000 prisoners by injection. Pardon me. The United States military conducted war crimes trials at Dachau for a variety of lesser-known concentration camp Nazis and their inmate collaborators, especially the medical killers. Katzenellenbogen was among them and was found guilty of war crimes, right along with the other so-called butchers of Buchenwald. He was sentenced to a long term in prison. The court finding, however, was not an easy one. It was complicated by conflicting stories of Katzenellenbogen's outstanding academic background and pre-war record. Many found Dr. Katzenellenbogen and the many lives he led incomprehensible. How could he alternately function as a gifted psychiatrist and as a murderous man of medicine? At the time, none understood that Katzenellenbogen viewed humanity with multiple standards. He was an American eugenicist, nor was he just any eugenicist. Katzenellenbogen was a founding member of the Eugenics Research Association and the chief eugenicist of New Jersey under then-Governor Woodrow Wilson. Viewing humanity through a eugenic prism, Katzenellenbogen was capable of exhibiting great compassion toward those he saw as superior and great cruelty toward those he considered genetically unfit. In Buchenwald, the French, with their Mediterranean and African hybridization, were eugenically among the lowest. They were not really worthy of life. At the same time, in Katzenellenbogen's view, those of Nordic or Aryan descent were treasured, to be helped and even saved. It all followed classic eugenic thought, but in Buchenwald, it was the difference between life and death. How did one of America's pioneer eugenicists wend his way from New Jersey to Buchenwald's notorious little camp? The story begins in late 19th century Poland. Katzenellenbogen was the name of a famous line of Polish and Czech rabbis going back centuries. However, as the doctor's life was built, he, or perhaps his immediate branch of the family, obscured any connection with a Jewish heritage. Like many European Jews who had drifted from tradition, he spelled his last name numerous ways, hyphenated and unhyphenated, and sometimes even signed his name Edwin K. Ellenbogen. He was probably born as Edwin Vladislav Katzenellenbogen in approximately 1882 in Stanisław in Austrian-occupied Poland. As a youth, Katzenellenbogen developed severe vision problems, but he achieved academic success despite the affliction, attending fine schools and developing extraordinary powers of observation and ratiocination. First, he studied at a Jesuit high school in Poland. Then he attended the University of Leipzig, where he secured his medical degree in 1905. While in medical school, he became engaged to a girl from Massachusetts, Marie A. Pierce, daughter of a judge and scion of a prominent family of Americans dating back to the Minutemen. In 1905, Katzenellenbogen sailed for America, settling briefly in Massachusetts, where he married Marie. He added Marie to his various middle names and utilized her family's connections to further his academic pursuits. Various letters of introduction were provided, as was the money Katzenelnbogen needed to continue his university work in Europe. There, he studied psychiatry with some of the best names in the field during the formative years of the profession, and he also learned the mystifying medical art of hypnosis. In 1907, Katzenelnbogen returned to the United States, where he was naturalized as a citizen and started work in state institutions, such as the Danvers State Hospital of Massachusetts. One of the early exponents of Freud in America, Katzenelnbogen became a Harvard lecturer in abnormal psychology. He developed expertise on fake symptoms. He authored an article in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology on, quote, the detection of a case of simulation of insanity by means of association tests. Katzenelnbogen began to specialize in epilepsy, especially with regard to mental deficiency. His expert testimony was pivotal in convicting a murderer who claimed diminished mental capacity due to an epileptic attack. The convicted man was electrocuted in 1912. He authored numerous articles on the subject and became a co-editor of the international quarterly Epilepsia. One of his articles asserted that different races should have their own standards for imbecility. A child, he posited, quote, may be inferior as to race, but be up to the mark for his own racial standards, especially in America. In 1911, Woodrow Wilson became governor of New Jersey. Katzenelnbogen was asked to become scientific director of the State Village for Epileptics at Skillman, New Jersey. It was there that he would develop his eugenic interests. While there, recalled Katzenelnbogen, I particularly studied the heredity background of epilepsy. As the state's leading expert, Katzenelnbogen was then asked by Wilson to draft New Jersey's law to sterilize epileptics and defectives. In the process, he became an expert on legal and legislative safeguards and jurisprudence. As a leading member of the National Association for the Study of Epilepsy, Katzenelnbogen delivered an address on epilepsy and feeble-mindedness at Goddard's Weinlard Training School. In 1913, Katzenelnbogen became charter member number 14 of the Eugenics Research Association at Cold Spring Harbor. The doctor continued his active membership even after he sailed for Russia in 1915, never to return to the United States. Katzenelnbogen bounced around the capitals of Europe for the next few years. He was about to board a ship in Holland when he received a telegram informing him that his only son had died in America after falling from a roof. Katzenelnbogen was never the same. He became morose and introspective, questioning the value of human life, at least his own. I contemplated to offer myself as physician to the leprosy colony in the upper state of New York, he recounted. He also considered suicide. At the same time, Katzenelnbogen deepened his fascination with things Catholic, purchasing a valued copy of a rare Madonna. As Katzenelnbogen wandered through Europe, he impressed many people as a kind humanitarian. He met one woman briefly on a train in 1921 and discussed his favorite Madonna. More than 2 decades later, even after learning of his notorious war crimes, she wrote him, quote, I cannot believe that anyone who likes a picture of the Madonna can be entirely bad, unquote. Years later, another woman, recalling their fond encounter in Germany, insisted, quote, there still are people in this world who believe in you, unquote. In 1925, Katzenelnbogen developed a relationship with a woman named Olga. She described him as the companion of my life. He described her as my old housekeeper. By any measure, Katzenelnbogen developed deep parental feelings for Olga's two orphaned grandsons and raised them as though they were his own. Together with his daughter, Katzenelnbogen led an ad hoc family of 5. They were living in Germany when Hitler rose to power. Despite his Catholic observances after the 1935 Nuremberg laws, Katzenelnbogen found himself defined as Jewish and subject to encircling anti-Jewish decrees. Like many practicing Christians of Jewish ancestry, he fled across the Czech border in 1936, establishing a clinic in Marienbad. When anti-Jewish agitation spread into Czechoslovakia, Katzenelnbogen moved again, this time to the democratic stronghold of Prague, where in 1938 he began working with refugee camps. After Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia in March of 1939, Katzenelnbogen followed a typical route of flight. First, he crossed into Italy. After war broke out in September of 1939, he escaped to France. But when the Nazis bifurcated France in 1940, Katzenelnbogen was caught in the occupied zone in Paris. As a result of his many recent relocations, he was a suspicious refugee in a city teeming with Gestapo agents. In 1941, he was arrested by Gestapo Counterintelligence Corps, but he was soon released. Like many foreigners living in Nazi-occupied Paris, Katzenelnbogen was ultimately arrested several times for questioning or detention. He was denied permission to leave for neutral Portugal. Finally, just as he was planning to leave for Prague in the late summer of 1943, Nazi security agents came for him. The knock on the door came at 6 a.m. Many eugenicists considered Nazi racial policies a biological ideal. Katzenelnbogen discounted his Jewish ancestry, considering himself a eugenicist first and foremost. This made him different and almost appealing to the Gestapo, especially under the circumstances. Although a prisoner, he was given access to top Nazi generals in Paris to discuss his detention status. The war stretched Nazis needed doctors, especially in occupied lands. As a distinguished physician and psychiatrist who spoke German and also enjoyed American citizenship, Katzenelnbogen became very useful to both the Gestapo and the Wehrmacht. Twice he was brought to the Reich military prison in France to examine a German soldier suffering from mental problems. Katzenelnbogen even testified as an expert at the soldiers' court-martial. Katzenelnbogen found himself in a somewhat unique position. Quote, "I was the only doctor in France, a psychiatrist," he recalled, "who was also qualified in Germany as a doctor, and they didn't have anybody with those skills in the army." Eventually, the overworked regular German army doctor visiting the military prison asked Katzenelnbogen, quote, "As you speak French anyway and other languages, relieve me here. And when something very important happens, they can telephone me." Thus, Katzenelnbogen became a general practitioner for the German military in Paris, even as he remained in custody. Eventually, Katzenelnbogen's services were requested for German military men outside the prison. For all intents and purposes, he was at the disposal of the German medical staff. But in September of 1943, when orders came from Berlin to transfer prisoners in France to slave labor camps in the Reich, Katzenelnbogen was put on a train and shipped to the dreaded Buchenwald. Pardon me. Pardon me, I have to reach over to reach the mute button, you know. It's one thing. We're going to have to work on our mute button accessibility issue, because what good is it if you can't, if you can't reach it? Well, it's a minor problem, but I do depend on my mute button, because if I take a drink and I don't use my mute button, then bad things happen. I didn't use it that time. All right. Okay, well, we're doing okay, aren't we? We're surviving this tour of Buchenwald, or at least this Katzen Ellenbogen. Isn't it interesting? Katzen just means cats, and Ellenbogen means elbow. What a odd name. But it's an ancient name, apparently an ancient Jewish name. But here's this person that says, you know what? It's not about my bloodline. It's about who I am. I'm a eugenicist. I'm not a Jew. I'm a Catholic, non-practicing, religious, just a regular person who mainly defined himself as a eugenicist and not as a Jew. But the Third Reich disagreed with him and said, "No, you're a Jew." And he continued with his optimistic view of eugenics. We've studied eugenics pretty thoroughly here at McDuff Channel. Daniel Okrent's book, The Guarded Gate, contributes a lot to it. Of course, this book here, War Against the Weak, the population control book by Jim Marrs, and a number of others that have shown without a doubt that eugenics is an American, British, and then, the German, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, which is funded by the Rockefellers, who in turn are funded by the big banks and the City of London banks. So we're starting to see the real powers behind World War II, and this ruthlessness of which they ruled, their side, whatever they were doing. If they're taking France, then they do it ruthlessly. And it's a reminder that it's as much as we condemn what the Holocaust against the Jewish people, particularly against the Gypsy or Roma people, particularly, but really also against humanity generally, and prisoners of war, and particularly, of course, if you were a communist or had any association with communism, because it was the communists that were the main underground, the main resistance. So that tinge of being a communist you don't have to be Jewish to be deported into the slave labor camps. And the French here in this example definitely suffered terribly. Buchenwald functioned for two purposes: to inflict cruelty on the Nazis' enemies, and to systematically work its inmates to death in service of the Reich. In that order. In the hierarchy of hell, Buchenwald was considered among the worst of Nazi labor camps. Hundreds to thousands of people died within its confines each week from beatings, disease, starvation, exhaustion, or execution. Cruel and painful medical experiments were also conducted at Buchenwald, especially in Block 46, known for its frosted windows and restricted access. Nazi doctors deliberately infected prisoners with typhus, converting their bodies into so many living test tubes, kept alive only as a convenient hosts for the virus. Doctors then carefully observed the progress of the disease in order to help evaluate potential vaccines. Some 600 men died from such infections. In addition, Russian POWs were deliberately burned with phosphorus to observe their reaction to drugs. As a part of the Reich's program to develop mass sterilization techniques, 15 men were castrated to observe the effects. 2 died from the operation. Experimental Section 5 employed gland implants and synthetic hormones on homosexuals to reverse their sex drive. The SS officers delighted in joking about the men. Those who survived these heinous tests or otherwise outlived their usefulness were often murdered with injections of phenol. Horrible punishments were everyday occurrences. Many were hung from their wrists with their hands tied behind their backs. Thus painfully tearing arms from their sockets. Weakened inmates who did not die quickly enough were bludgeoned with large blood-encrusted club. Russian POWs were systematically shot in the back of the neck through a small hole as they stood at the height measuring wall. Large electric lifts continuously shuttled corpses to waiting crematoria, which operated 10 hours a day and produced prodigious heaps of white ash. Death was an hourly event at Buchenwald. Ultimately, more than 50,000 perished. More French died than any other national group. But before the victims were burned, they performed additional service to the Reich. Pathologists in Block 2 dissected some 35,000 corpses so their body parts could be studied and then stored in various jars on shelves. Tattooed prisoners were especially prized. In Block 2, their skins were stripped off, tanned, and stretched into lampshades and other memorabilia. Nuremberg trial judges denounced conditions so ghastly that they defy description. The proof is overwhelming that in the administration of the concentration camps, the German war machine, and first and foremost the SS, resorted to practices which would shame the most primitive race of savage barbarians. All the instincts of human decency which distinguished men from beasts were forgotten, and the law of the jungle took command. If there is such a thing as a crime against humanity, here we have it, repeated 1,000,000 times over. In assessing Buchenwald just after liberation, a British parliamentary delegation declared, "We have endeavored to write with restraint and objectivity and to avoid obtruding personal reactions or emotional comments. We would conclude, however, by stating that such camps as this mark the lowest point of degradation to which humanity has yet descended. The memory of what we saw and heard at Buchenwald will haunt us ineffaceably for many years." Most new arrivals at Buchenwald were instantly shocked by the camp's brutality and the physical cruelty heaped upon them by the guards. Upon initial entry, it was common for new prisoners to run a 200-meter gauntlet of guards who viciously beat them with clubs and truncheons as they passed. But Katzenellenbogen seemed fascinated. Recalling his first moments in the camp, he said, quote, "I was really amazed about the efficiency and quickness about everything that happened there." He added, quote, "We were treated not badly there." Katzenellenbogen was in fact privileged from the moment he entered the camp. While other prisoners at that time were forced into tattered zebra-stripe uniforms, the doctor was permitted to wear civilian attire, including a 3-piece suit and tie. But he complained that the shirt with its button-down collar was too small, and the trousers too long. His warm, furry hat and medical armband gave him a distinctive look as he toured the barracks. Early on, Buchenwald administrators learned through the prisoner grapevine of Katzenellenbogen's helpfulness to the Gestapo in France. He quickly became a trusted prisoner to the camp's medical staff as well as the SS officers, especially Chief Camp Doctor Gerhard Schiedlowski. Katzenellenbogen announced to everyone that he was an American doctor from New Jersey and a skilled hypnotist to boot. None of this failed to impress the camp administrators, who often referred to him by the name Dr. K. Ellenbogen. One senior Nazi medic dared Katzenelnbogen to demonstrate his skill as a hypnotist. A test subject was brought over, and within 5 minutes, Katzenelnbogen successfully placed him in a trance. Thereafter, Katzenelnbogen was assigned to the hospital at the little camp, which functioned as the segregated new prisoner intake unit. Unlike the other inmates who slept 16 deep on stark wooden shelves and were fed starvation rations, Katzenelnbogen enjoyed a private room with a real bed that he shared with only one other block trustee. He ate plenty of vegetables and even meat purchased through black market sources in Weimar. From time to time, he cooked his own meals, an almost unimaginable prisoner luxury. The doctor was able to count SS and Gestapo officers among his friends. Even his fellow prisoners detested him and despised their Nazi taskmasters. He was widely believed to be a Gestapo spy. One day in mid-1944, the camp doctor, Schiedlowski, summoned Katzenelnbogen to the SS hospital. "You're a hypnotizer," said Schiedlowski with distress. "You're a psychotherapist. Save me." In the midst of the human depravity he oversaw, Schiedlowski had become unable to sleep. Self-administered drugs were no help. Katzenelnbogen replied, quote, "I can help you only, doctor, if you will forget that I am a prisoner and you are the SS doctor." Schiedlowski collegially replied, quote, "Naturally." As Katzenelnbogen analyzed Schiedlowski's dreams, he concluded that the SS doctor's mind was troubled by a great burden. "Unless you are willing to tell me what it is," Schiedlowski answered. Unless you are willing to tell me what it is," Katzenelnbogen told him, "no further treatment would be of value." Schiedlowski answered, "You're right, but I can't tell you." At one point, Katzenelnbogen came upon Schiedlowski weeping uncontrollably and consoled the man. Katzenelnbogen continued to treat Schiedlowski, whose mental state deteriorated. Soon, Katzenelnbogen was exercising great influence over the camp doctor. Schiedlowski was so impressed with Katzenelnbogen that he asked him to treat other SS men unable to sleep because of their murderous deeds. Even though Katzenelnbogen was a prisoner, the Nazis opened up to him. For example, a bloodthirsty Austrian-born SS lieutenant named Dumberg admitted to Katzenelnbogen that he was haunted day and night by the ghosts of at least 40 men he had personally beaten to death. As though confessing to a priest, Dumberg admitted that sometimes when he caught someone stealing vegetables from the garden, he just couldn't control himself. It would typically begin as an urge to only slap the prisoner. But then Dumberg would begin jumping on the man's body until his ribs caved in. Katzenelnbogen helped Dumberg realize why he could not sleep. The killings. "That's it exactly," Dumberg agreed. Dumberg was so grateful that he granted Katzenelnbogen special privileges, ironically, to the vegetables in the garden. Katzenelnbogen proudly remembered that the SS men, quote, "trusted me as a doctor very much." Back at the little camp, Katzenelnbogen administered cruel medicine. He forced Frenchmen to exercise in the frigid outdoors without their scarves and without their shirts, this to cure infected throats. He smuggled in needed medicines through the SS medics, but then sold them for money or favors. Such extortions allowed him to deposit some 50,000 francs in a camp bank account. He also cached large quantities of Danish food, medicines, and cigarettes in his bedroom, mainly pilfered from the Danish Red Cross packets turned over by the sick and injured. Denying medical treatment was an entrenched eugenic practice at the state institutions Katzenelnbogen was familiar with, from Danvers in Massachusetts to Skillman and Vineland in New Jersey. In those institutions, eugenic psychiatrists felt that medical care only kept alive those whom nature intended to die off. Katzenellenbogen applied the same principles in Buchenwald. Katzenellenbogen capriciously decided who entered the hospital. Another camp doctor confirmed in court it depended on Katzenellenbogen whether a certain person would be admitted into the little hospital or in the main hospital. A Czech doctor added, quote, if he found a man with appendicitis or pneumonia and said, I will not send you to the hospital, then the man would not get through because he, Dr. Katzenellenbogen, was the only medical liaison in the camp. Katzenellenbogen himself casually admitted at his trial, quote, we selected. Let's say there were 35 needing hospitalization and there are only 17 free beds. Which 17 should have preference for immediate hospitalization? He held the power of life and death over those who desperately needed his help, and he sadistically exercised this power every day. In 1944, two French arrivals, a Protestant minister named Roux and a doctor named Rodochy, suffered greatly during the horrific railroad trip to Buchenwald. Upon entering the little camp, compatriots asked that Roux and Rodochy be admitted to the hospital. Katzenellenbogen refused the first day. Even as they became weaker, he continued his refusals for 2 more days. On the 4th day, the two died during roll call, having never been seen by any doctor. After the war, a French physician internee identified as Denis told investigators that many men died who might have recovered had they been admitted to the hospital, but when French prisoners approached, Katzenellenbogen often chased them away, slapped and punched them, or simply beat them with any instrument handy. Other inmates who were physicians would sometimes complain that Katzenellenbogen stocked the necessary medicines, but that the little camp doctor would snarl that they were in Buchenwald to, quote, die like dogs, not to be cured. At his trial, prosecutors demanded answers. And then now here we have a little transcript to read. Prosecutor, isn't it also a fact, doctor, that many a prisoner died while he was waiting his turn to be examined there at the dispensary? Katzenellenbogen, when patients arrived, he, a medical staffer, went outside and looked who was the most ill and needed immediate attention or in a dangerous condition to get them there first. Just answer the question, please. Answer. If you want me to answer the question yes or no, then I will have to say no. All right, then your answer is, at no time did any prisoner die while waiting his turn to be examined at the dispensary. Answer. You say those questions as though with a revolver with hands up. It is impossible to answer whether yes or no. Question. You were there, were you not? Answer. I was there. Question. You know whether a man is living or dead, don't you? Answer. Yes. Question. All right. Did any man die while he was awaiting his turn in that line? Answer. Sure he did. Question. I thought you said a moment ago he didn't. Answer. Yes, that's what I said. That is a revolver, a little so. Yes, but not while he was awaiting his turn and because of waiting, but because he was in a condition that a few minutes later, while they brought him in, he was dead. Question. Just listen to my questions, please, doctor. I did not ask you because he was waiting in that line. I know. That is why I said yes. Failure to be hospitalized also bestowed a death sentence because it often facilitated assignment to the fatal work details at the nearby Dora works. At Dora, slave laborers were systematically worked to death, tunneling into a mountain, constructing the secret German V-2 missile facilities. Dora's death rate was among the highest of any of the thousands of labor camps and subcamps in all of Nazi-occupied Europe. Many of Dora's victims were shuttled in from Buchenwald. Transports regularly delivered thousands of prisoners at a time, and some 20,000 of them died in backbreaking labor. In fact, for the Nazi campaign known as extermination by labor, Dora was a convenient final destination to extract a prisoner's final urges of energy. The weakened inmates, whom Katzenelnbogen callously refused to exempt from Dora work transports, were essentially sentenced to death. In one typical transport of 1,000 to 1,200 French workers whom Katzenelnbogen reviewed, only 97 came back alive. Indeed, the Dora Kommando, or work detail, was known everywhere as a death commando. One Frenchman, when condemned to duty at Dora, turned to Katzenelnbogen and declared, César morituri te salutant, which, in Latin, what is the Latin? Ave Kaiser morituri salutamus. Anyway, that was the French. I'm ashamed I can't remember the Latin. Oh well. We who are about to die salute you. The same thing they used to say to the Caesars when they were fighting in the gladiators in the Colosseum. Katzenelnbogen recalled jocundly that the man, quote, still had a sense of humor. At his trial, Katzenelnbogen was asked by prosecutors, the personnel in the medical department certainly knew that Dora was a death commando, isn't that so? Katzenelnbogen replied, I should guess so. Prisoners reported that Katzenelnbogen actually encouraged unsuspecting French inmates to volunteer for the death details. In one instance, a Frenchman discovered the ruse and warned comrades to remove their names from the volunteer roster. Katzenelnbogen reported the Frenchman who spread the warning, and the prisoner was brutally punished. Certainly, many concentration camp trustees, capos, and block elders curried favor by demonstrating heightened brutality toward the inmates under their authority, but many used their trusted positions to subtly connive and cajole the SS in small ways, helping others survive. For example, Austrian journalist Eugen Kogan worked as a clerk in Buchenwald's hospital under the notorious Dr. Erwin Ding Schuler. It was Ding Schuler who in 1941 wrote in his diary, quote, since tests on animals are not of sufficient value, tests on human beings must be carried out, unquote. When testifying against Katzenelnbogen, Kogan explained to prosecutors that it was not necessary to be merciless even when working for the most depraved doctors. I worked in exactly the opposite way, he said. I made Major Dr. Ding Schuler a tool of the prisoners, and all this only in a positive manner from the beginning to the end. That is the difference. Kogan went on to write numerous articles and books on the inhumanity of concentration camps, such as Buchenwald. Camp medical men did more than just withhold treatment. Many actively participated in the murder process itself. Katzenelnbogen was publicly accused of finishing off 1,000 men with injections. The fact that thousands were killed by an instantly acting injection, 20 cc of phenol, was amply proved, but there were no witnesses to corroborate that Katzenelnbogen was among the medics who wielded the hypodermics. He never directly denied being involved in injections, although he asserted he was unaware of Szydlowski's mass injection campaign in Block 61. When the subject of injections was brought up in court, Katzenelnbogen nonchalantly testified that the allegation against him was just that, an allegation in the newspapers that could not be proved. I'm going to skip to the end of the chapter because we're running out of time. I'm just skipping about 2 pages, but it's just more examples of the horrific change that can come across a person, you know. I mean, a humanitarian doctor becomes influenced by eugenics following a terrible personal tragedy. And the next thing you know, he's participating in mass murder for the Nazis, despite his own Jewish heritage. This is not a unique, but I think it's the chapter has told this man's tragic story very well. When it finally came time to sum up, Katzenelnbogen virtually commanded the judges to take the contradictions and inconsistencies into account. From the witness box, he reminded the judges, quote, "It is a legal principle of all courts of all nations, the Romans as well in that time, in dubio provero, that which in English says, give them the benefit of the doubt. That means if you are in doubt about my guilt, you have to acquit me." Then he actually invited the judges to commit a reversible error. "But I reverse that case," he continued. "Even if you are in any doubt that I am not guilty, convict me, because I would have a chance then in a higher court or other place to defend myself in a way that I perhaps didn't do here." On August 14th, 1947, in a Dachau barrack set up for war crime trials, Katzenelnbogen stood, somewhat disheveled, before the military tribunal. Flanked by 3 shiny helmeted MPs, his shoelaces removed to prevent suicide, 4 bright lights above to aid the photographers, Edwin Marie Katzenelnbogen awaited his judgment. Without evidence of specific murders, he could not be hanged, as were other medical war criminals at Buchenwald. Instead, the tribunal used the legal theory that applied to so many Nazi conspirators. This theory was called common design, meaning that Katzenelnbogen joined a common design to perpetrate the horrors of Buchenwald on the inmates. It is clear, concluded the tribunal, that the accused, although an inmate, cooperated with the SS personnel managing the camp and participated in the common design. Judgment, guilty. Sentence, life imprisonment. Katzenelnbogen appealed, issuing a pro se cascade of letters, petitions, and motions, stressing his American citizenship and desire to help mankind. Upon review, his sentence was commuted to 15 years. Katzenelnbogen then appealed for special clemency on the ground of poor health. In July of 1950, a clemency board comprised of 3 civilian attorneys reduced his sentence to 12 years, concluding, "Katzenelnbogen's health is poor. He is suffering from a coronary insufficiency causing severe myocardic damage and a chronic congestive heart failure." He had all the symptoms. Well, that concludes the chapter on this remarkably malleable human being, Katzenelnbogen, American, married to a Massachusetts woman of wealth and, quote, breeding, unquote, and a proponent of eugenics. All of this tells a story that we cannot ignore, as the forces of imperial doom impend upon us now. These folks, that was not 100 years ago. This is 80 years ago, 75 years ago. Some of these people are still alive. Humanity can go that low again, and we must be ever vigilant. Thanks for being with me tonight. I'm going to reach over here and see if we can't get the ospreys to say goodnight.